Come on, get in there. There we go, there we go, there we go. Ooh, just in time. Okay, well, hey, it's 11 o'clock. Just in the nick of time. Let me get rid of this stuff. Today is Thursday, January 28th, 2021. You guys are biology 1160, section 2. I'm pretty sure. A Tuesday, Thursday, 11 o'clock class. And let's see, last time we were doing histology and getting through the epithelial tissue. We do glandular epithelium. We're not on connective tissue yet, are we?
We're on follicle type.
Okay, yeah, for the glandular epithelium. This one, is that the last thing we talked about right here?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so that's, okay. So we didn't talk about this slide yet. So this is where we are. This, let me start this, I think. Oh, I gotta fix my display here. Still got people entering. Hang on, let me fix my lights. Yeah, like it. That's good. So we classified all the, the membrane epithelium. Then I was telling you that there's two types, two categories. Most of it is the cord and clump type of endocrine glands, or cord and cluster, I like to say. Clump just kind of sounds weird. But then there's the follicular type, the type that have follicles, like the thyroid gland and the ovary, really. But then we have your just endocrine glands, just regular glands that you would think of normally as a endocrine gland. And then you have other things that produce hormones too. And so you have endocrine glands and endocrine-like organs, all right? And so I have one other classification scheme to group all the members of the endocrine system. And it begins with, first, true endocrine glands. And I have this group of true endocrine glands because these are the glands that their primary function is hormone secretion. You would think, well, what else would they do? Well, they don't do anything else. They just, they're, members of the endocrine system. They produce hormones, and then that's it. And so obviously there's structures other than that in the endocrine system, but the true endocrine glands, that's their primary function. That's the only thing they really do. And it includes, I have this as a comprehensive list of all of them, and we'll talk about some of them in passing when we come to them. But the actual function and the types of hormones they produce, you'll get more into that when you start studying phys. But anyway, but true endocrine glands include the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, the adrenal glands, the pineal gland, and the thymus glands. And that's, all they do. But there's other things in the endocrine gland or the endocrine system as well. You have a special gland or organ that's known as an endoexocrine gland. So what are endoexocrine glands? That's kind of a combination kind of deal right there. You see the endoexocrine, and what is it, one or the other or both? Well, it's both. Endoexocrine glands are hormone-producing glands that also produce exocrine products. The exocrine products, of course, that would be a non-hormone secretion of some sort. Well, what is that? Who does that? Well, there's only one example of that, and that's the pancreas. When we study the digestive system, we'll look at this in more detail. But the pancreas is a duct gland. It has a duct, pancreatic duct, and some other ducts as well. And that duct is to convey pancreatic juice, associated with the digestive system. But it also has tissues embedded in it, like little islands of endocrine tissue as well, that produce hormones that aren't duct, they're ductless, and they get into the bloodstream, et cetera. So it's a combination. So it's part of the endocrine system, but it's an endocrine exocrine gland. They say both. There's a lot of people late today. Okay. Number 3 are neuroendocrine glands. See, neuro for like nervous system. Get that? What are neuroendocrine glands? Neuroendocrine glands are hormone-producing nerve tissue. Okay, nerve tissue, completely different body system, the nervous system. All right. So, what is that? Well, there's only one example of that: the hypothalamus. If you look up the hypothalamus, you'll find out that in fact it is a portion or a region of the brain. And when we study the nervous system, specifically the central nervous system, looking at the brain, parts of the brain, regions of the brain, we'll see that the hypothalamus is part of the brain. But it's a part of the brain that makes unique hormones. And so it's part of the endocrine system as well. So it is a neuroendocrine gland, okay? And then finally, the 4th category I have are all your endocrine-like organs, okay? This is kind of like my junk drawer of classification. I always have one of those junk drawers, right? My junk drawer here is basically, everything else that produces hormones of some sort. If you think about it, just about every tissue, every organ makes some kind of hormones. But these are some classic endocrine-like organs. And I put them in this category because these are organs with hormone-producing cells, but have a non-endocrine primary function, okay? So you would think that their primary function is something else, or that they belong to another body system. For example, this first one right here, the gonads, ovaries and the testes. What body system would you classify the gonads in? Well, that's part of the reproductive system, right? So the reproductive system, although the ovaries and the testes produce hormones, sex hormones. And so that has endocrine producing tissues. The stomach as well, and the duodenum, both of those are part of the digestive system, right? But each of those produce their own types of hormones. And again, you'll learn about this in phys. The kidney, that's the urinary system, that makes hormones. Your skin, that's the integumentary system. Of course, your heart, circulatory system, it produces its own hormones. And then the placenta, well, that's, you don't have a placenta, but, that's a product of the reproductive system. It's to sustain a developing fetus, but it produces its own hormones as well. So there you go. Those are all your endocrine glands and endocrine-like organs. And I think that sums up epithelial tissue. So Remember, there's 4 types of tissues: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, nervous tissue, muscle tissue. And so now we're at our second type of tissue, connective tissue. And we'll kind of go through it the same way, talk about characteristics of it, and then I'm going to give you some examples like in the table. Classify it in the whole 9 yards, okay? Just like that. Okay, advance. There we go. So what is connective tissue? Well, here I tell you, during embryological development, ectoderm and endoderm are separated by a third germ layer, mesoderm. Remember that? That mesoderm that kind of grows out of endoderm? Well, among other tissues, mesoderm develops into mesenchyme. Mesenchyme is often referred to as embryonic connective tissue because, mesoderm makes other things like muscle, but some of the the descendant or derived tissue that comes out of mesoderm is this stuff called mesenchyme. And mesenchyme is slated, for one of a better term, slated to become all your connective tissue. And so it's a very primitive form. It's an undifferentiated form of connective tissues. It's not any particular type at one point, but mesenchyme is unusual for a tissue because it actually these cells in the embryo migrate, and they kind of detach and creep along and set up shop in different parts of the developing embryo and develop into a type of connective tissue. So mesenchyme, you study embryology, you learn all about it. It's pretty cool. And anyway, for right now, we just think of mesenchyme as just embryonic connective tissue. It's going to form all the connective tissue. And it, in turn, came from mesoderm, okay? So what does the mesenchyme do? Well, it further differentiates into all the connective tissues of the body, which include, and I just kind of list them here, and then we'll look at our table. I like to have like a one slide that kind of shows you everything. First, what I like to call connective tissue proper. Why do you say that, connective tissue proper? When you use that word proper, what are you talking about? You're referring to like in the strict sense. Connective tissue in the strict sense, other than some kind of weird exceptions or whatever. When we look at this, it'll hopefully make sense. Now, of connective tissue proper, there's 2 forms. There's loose and dense forms. What does that mean, loose and dense? Well, we're referring to being the makeup of the matrix or the material, the extracellular material that's in there. It'll have sparsely distributed or scantily spaced structures. It's just like a lot of room, or it'll be jam-packed full of inclusions. And so it's dense, it's not a lot of room, it's real crowded. And so we talk about those. And there's reasons for having both. And when we go over the examples, you'll see why. So first, connective tissue proper, loose and dense forms. And then 2, here's where we start getting into the things that are not so proper because they're strange and they're kind of like in their own category. They are a connective tissue, but it's a special kind of connective tissue, cartilage. There's different types of cartilages, but cartilage kind of just falls into its own class because it's very unique, and we'll talk about its characteristics and so forth. But again, it's derived from mesenchyme, just like your connective tissue proper is. And then 3, bone. Now you have bone, the organ, and bone, the tissue. Here I'm talking about bone, the tissue, or we're going to refer to it as osseous connective tissue. Osseous just means bony, right? And so bone is unique. It's there's nothing like bone, nothing like osseous connective tissue. It's a very derived, specialized form. It's different than cartilage. It's different than the connective tissue proper, you know, and so forth. And so, and it's in its own category. And then fourth, this is probably the strangest of all the four, blood, or what we call vascular connective tissue. What's so strange about blood? Well, blood, if you think about it, blood is a connective tissue. Yeah, it's a connective tissue because it also is derived from mesenchyme. It has all the characteristics of connective tissue, et cetera, et cetera. But it has a liquid matrix. You know, it's liquid. You can pour blood. You can't pour bone. You can't pour cartilage or any of those connective tissue proper categories. We're going to see there's a bunch of those. You can't pour those. They're all, you know, solid or at least gelatinous. Okay, so that's unique. So what else? Well, as you can see, connective tissue is pretty diverse. And so here I tell you that connective tissue is the most abundant and widely distributed tissue in the body, more so than any of the other categories of tissues. So what makes connective tissue connective tissue? The characteristics, yes, of course. First, number one, all connective tissue has a matrix, presence of a matrix. Oh, great. So what's a matrix? A matrix consists of an amorphous ground substance of fluid, gel, or solid consistency. The matrix surrounds and supports the cells, proteins, and other inclusions of the connective tissue. So basically, it's just all the area and stuff included outside of the cells. We say amorphous ground substance. Well, that's kind of a fancy description. It just doesn't really have a consistent shape or whatever, but it's what things are contained in. And so this is very different than epithelial tissue. There was no such thing as a matrix or extracellular space or something like that in epithelial tissue. Okay, so this is new. All these things are very new and very connective tissue related. You know, you have a matrix, you know, that has stuff in it. Of course, you have your cells. You might have proteins, you might have some minerals or other just stuff, extracellular material surrounding the cells. And that would be all part of that tissue, okay? So you have a matrix. Number two, well, you have extracellular space. Remember in epithelial tissue, you didn't have extracellular space because the cells are all crowded together, okay? So here I tell you that's extracellular space. The cells of connective tissue are typically widely distributed within the matrix. And so you see it like a section of connective tissue. You might have a cell here, a cell there, a cell over here. So they're just kind of just scattered everywhere. But they're all part of a tissue, okay? The other material that's in there. The third thing is that connective tissue is typically vascularized and innervated, okay? This is also in stark contrast to epithelial tissue. Remember, epithelial tissue was never vascularized or innervated because there was no room, there was no extracellular space, okay? But connective tissue, when you're looking at a section of connective tissue, it's not uncommon to find blood vessels and nerves and other things traversing through it. I included a weird exception is in cartilage. Cartilage is the only exception that you're never going to find blood vessels or nerves traveling through cartilage. Okay, you'll find it in bone, but not cartilage. And it's just kind of a weird thing because of how the matrix of cartilage is formed. Okay, so there's that. And then fourth, and this makes sense too, connective tissue is never exposed to a free surface, right? Remember, epithelial tissue always is. Epithelial tissue is always exposed to a free surface, but that'll never happen in connective tissue. Why? Well, because epithelial tissue, remember, always has to be on top. So here I have it's typically separated from the free surface by an epithelial tissue. And this, I included this mostly for my lab students, because you're in laboratory, you're challenged to identify tissues under the microscope. And so you're presented with, a tissue, and you try to figure out what it is. And so a lot of times you have to use, you have to make educated guesses and deduce, hey, what could this be? You ask yourself certain questions and so forth. You typically won't have a connective tissue, at an opening or free surface or adjacent to a duct or a cavity or something like that. So that's not going to happen because that epithelial tissue fits that position. Okay. So some other characteristics of connective tissue. We talk about some of the constituents of the matrix, the stuff that you would find in. Of course, you have cells, right? But then there's other things in there, and a lot of the times the material that's in the matrix is some kind of protein. So I want you to be familiar with some of the common protein fibers that you would expect to find in the matrix of connective tissue. The number one, and it's probably most of the time when you're looking at connective tissue, this is the most common protein fiber that you would find. Collagen fibers, because it's made out of the protein collagen. Sometimes collagen fibers are called white fibers just based on their appearance, what they look like. If you ever look at cuts of meat or whatever, and you look at what you'd call sinew, or just, that's some kind of white kind of connective tissue, the stuff you would cut away. It's not really fat, but it's really a tendon, ligament kind of stuff. Well, it's kind of almost has a iridescent sheen to it. It's white. Okay, that's all collagen. And so collagen fibers, very, very common in different types of connective tissue. So here I tell you, collagen fibers are the most abundant. They're formed from the protein collagen, isn't it? That's what they're named after. And of course, functionally, the collagen fibers provide a very strong, stress-resistant and flexible structure of some sort. If you think about tendons and ligaments and then other properties of other tissues, what allows them to be strong and stress-resistant and kind of flexible is the presence of these collagen fibers. The analogy I always give for collagen fibers are toe straps. You know what a toe strap is? Like when you pull a truck out of the mud, you pull it out with a chain, but then you got these kind of canvas material toe straps. Very tough, the toe strap, very strong. You can roll them up, and they can package them, but you unwind them, but they're very, very strong. Tensile strength in one direction or the other. It's kind of what collagen fiber is. And it acts like that in different areas where it's included, okay? So collagen, and everybody's heard of collagen, very common animal protein, okay? Now, it can exist in other forms. It doesn't have to occur as these little toe straps or fibers. It can be in different forms, but we're going to look at a lot of these fibers. Now, another kind of fiber are called elastic fibers. Elastic fibers are sometimes called yellow fibers because to the naked eye, they look more of a yellowish look, different kind of color than collagen fibers, because they're made out of a completely different protein. The name of the protein that makes elastic fibers is called elastin. Elastin is the name of the protein. And like you might expect, elastic fibers have the properties of stretch and recoil, like a spring. You can stretch out a spring, but the spring can recoil, okay? And so this type of fiber would be invested in tissues that need those properties, like your skin, your lungs, blood vessels, etc. Okay. Now, when you do see elastic fibers present, they're often accompanied by collagen fibers. Now, the collagen fibers are the strong, stress-resistant toe straps, right? And they're laid down to prevent overstretch, because you can overstretch or ruin a collagen fiber, like a little spring. You know, they remind me of, well, collagen fibers remind me of toe straps. Elastic fibers remind me of slinkies. You know what a slinky is? Y'all remember Slinky? Slinky, a slinky, it's fun, it's a wonderful toy. Slinky, a slinky, fun for a girl or a boy. It walks downstairs together in pairs. Kind of aging myself. Well, anyway, slinkies were a fun little toy we had when we were a kid. I don't know if they make them out of metal anymore, but they used to be made out of metal. But I think nowadays, if they exist, they're made out of plastic like everything else. But they were fun, you know, I guess, for a little while. And until you get bored, you try to, you know, see how far you can stretch out your slinky. And then how do you break a slinky? Well, if you stretch it too much, it won't recoil anymore. It's like, oh man, it doesn't, like, because it used to condense like in about the size of a half a can of Coke or something, not that big. Get that by the, and you know, it would slink, you know. But if you pulled it too high, it would stretch out the wire and it wouldn't work. Well, in your body, elastic fibers can do the same thing. But these collagen fibers are there to kind of prevent that happening, but doesn't make that overstretch proof. It just kind of helps prevent it. I mean, you can do this like in your skin. If you exceed the limits of your collagen fibers and you overstretch those elastic fibers, they won't recoil, and that's what causes stretch marks. Your skin doesn't kind of snap back the way it should. Everybody knows about stretch marks, right? Whether you're a weightlifter or a mother, everybody knows about stretch marks. Okay. So the third tissue that or fiber that we can find in connective tissues are called reticular fibers. Now, reticular fibers are really not any different than collagen fibers, because as a matter of fact, they are collagen fibers, but they're a special kind of collagen fibers. These guys aren't really constructed to be strong and stretch resistant and that sort of thing, but they are structural, okay? But what makes them different? Well, these are little collagen fibers. They're fine little branching collagen fibers. They form networks of a framework for organs. Actually, the internal soft skeleton of an organ is called the reticulum. So the reticular fibers form a reticulum. So of course, reticulum means network of these little collagen fibers. And it forms that internal soft skeleton to which all the other functional cells and tissues are adhered to. Like if you look at the structure of any organ, like I have muscles, nerves, blood vessels, glands, you know, like the shape of a lymph node, for example. It's a classic place to look at reticular fibers. Like the shape of a lymph node, you know, it has a shape, you know, your kidneys have a shape. Everything has a shape, you know, and the cells, if you removed all the functional cells, you know, what you'd have basically left over would be like a little proteinaceous skeleton, you know, but it's not a skeleton made out of bone or cartilage. It's collagen, you know, this little collagenous skeleton. That's the reticulum, okay? And you can, I'm gonna, you know what? I forgot all about this. I have a rat that has been cleared and stained, where you can remove all the you remove all the other tissues out of it and just leave behind all the collagen, the reticulum, and it's just I'll bring it. I'll have to remember to bring that next week. It's kind of cool, anyway. But it's a skeleton in general. You know, so what's a skeleton for? You know, we'll talk all about this when we talk about the skeletal system. But you know, there's all kinds of things that can pass as a skeleton, you know, that forms an internal framework or support, you know, and so organs have that too. And of course, you know, inside an organ, like I said, there's no bone or cartilage, but you have collagen, you know, in the form of reticular fibers. Okay, so you have fibers in connective tissue, but you also have cells, and there's all kinds of cells. We're learn about different types of cells and different types of tissues. So I want you to be familiar with this and familiar with the lingo and the language and the buzzwords and all that kind of stuff. And so here I give you a little background on the cells of connective tissue. Okay, so here I tell you that the mitotically active cells that produce the matrix are called blast cells. See that blast, B-L-A-S-T? The word blast means literally bud. You see that? Bud. Now, what's a bud? You know, like a flower bud. What's a flower bud? Well, it's the flower before it's a flower. It's an immature flower. Okay, it's going to become a flower. Well, a bud cell or a blast cell is like the immature cell. And so anytime you see so-and-so blast, it's an immature cell. It's going to become some kind of specialized cell. So I want you to know about the different types of blast cells. There's four primary types of blast cells. One, fibroblasts. That's pretty easy. Fibroblast. These are the fiber-forming cells. Get it? You know, these produce collagen, they produce elastic, and they produce reticular fibers. So anytime you see any of these fibers, you would expect to also see fibroblasts, right? So there you go. You also have chondroblasts. Chondro, anytime you hear chondro, think cartilage, right? So chondroblasts, those are the cartilage-forming cells. And so where cartilage is forming, you're going to have these cartilage-forming cells, or chondroblasts. Likewise, osteoblast. Those are bone-forming cells. Well, bone-forming cells lay down a bony matrix, or they'll help turn something to bone, right? Then the fourth one, hemocytoblast. Heme means blood, cyto means cell, right? So blood cell forming cells. Get it? Blood cell forming cells, hemocytoblast. And so you have immature cells, you'd have mature cells. So there's a difference. You have the blast cells, and then you have the cytes, the mature cells. The mature cells of connective tissue are indicated via the suffix cyte, C-Y-T-E, just means cell. So when we tag that onto a word as a suffix, you're supposed to understand that you know, it's a fully mature cell. For example, fibroblasts become fibrocytes, or get it? The mature fiber cells. Chondroblasts become chondrocytes, and then you have osteocytes. Now, you don't have hemocytocytes. You have two different types of cells that are formed from hemocytoblasts. Okay, the blood cell forming cells, they form either erythrocytes or leukocytes. Okay, what's the difference between erythrocytes and leukocytes? Well, erythrocytes, those are your red blood cells, or RBCs, if you want to use the abbreviation. And the leukocytes are the white blood cells, or WBCs, I guess you can say that. And there's only really one type of red blood cell. Erythro means red, literally red cell, erythrocytes. And those are the ones that are responsible for carrying the respiratory gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. But then your leukocytes, your white blood cells. Now you say, oh, leuko must mean white cell. Actually, leuko doesn't mean white. This is kind of confusing why they call them white blood cells. Why do they call them white blood cells? They're not white. Well, they're called leukocytes. Leuko means yellow, so they're yellow cells. I guess yellow cells doesn't sound good enough, but they're called white blood cells for yellow blood cells. But under the microscope, they stain various shades of blue or purple. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's about half a dozen or so different types of white blood cells. And we'll talk about that when we talk, because, you know, blood is a connective tissue, vascular connective tissue. And it, you know, it has a matrix, it has proteins, and it has cells. And then we're going to look at all the above. Okay. So there we go. What are the, you know, I can see the blast cells, they form all this stuff, but then once you're mature cells, what do the mature cells do? Well, they just kind of hang around and maintain the matrix, you know, because the tissue is living tissue, right? And so they'll be there. So any of these connective tissues would have, you know, blast and or mature cells in the matrix. Okay. The classification of connective tissue. Again, here, I kind of just like to, before we get into the table, just kind of list them all so you can have them all together. Remember, there's the connective tissue proper. And then I said of the proper, there's two groups. There's a loose connective tissue group and a dense connective tissue group. The loose connective tissue group includes three. Remember, there's always three. Areolar, adipose, and reticular connective tissue. These three fall into this category. And, you know, I want you to, you know, understand that, because when we're talking about categories and so on and so forth, I ask you questions. This is a good place to, you know, keep all this straight in your mind. And then of the dense connective tissue group, there's also three, okay? There's dense regular connective tissue. Some books call it white fibrous connective tissue. It's the same thing, okay? Then there's dense irregular connective tissue, and then elastic connective tissue. In the camp that uses the verbiage white fibrous, they would probably refer to elastic connective tissue as yellow fibrous connective tissue, because these two fibrous connective tissues, one's made out of elastin, the other one's made out of collagen. Okay, but we'll talk about that. So this is the proper. Again, why do I use that word proper? Well, I mean, I said in the strict sense, you know, because these are like your if there was a regular connective tissue, these are like your kind of regular, unmodified, strange connective tissues. Have you ever heard anybody use the word like proper before in describing something? Like for example, a lot of times people ask me, "Where are you from?" You know, so I live in Lake Charles. So where do you live? So I live in Lake Charles, because it's easier just saying live in Lake Charles. But I don't live in Lake Charles. I live in Moss Bluff. Really, Moss Bluff? Well, no, I don't even live in Moss Bluff, you know, but it's just easier to say Lake Charles, you know. And you say, do you live in Lake Charles, or just Lake Charles metropolitan area? Not Lake Charles proper, but just, you know, Lake Charles area. So when you say Lake Charles proper or Houston proper or New Orleans proper, that's in the strict sense. You know, what's the strict sense? Well, how that those cities are defined. They're defined, they have limits, right? You know, they have boundaries, you know, say, okay, no, this is what defines it. You know, this is that. And you're close to it, but you're not quite, you know, you're whatever. You're not proper, not in the strict sense. So that's what I'm talking about here. These guys, these six tissues, connective tissue proper, without any kind of weird kind of exceptions. Because you look at the next groups, like cartilage, there's nothing like cartilage, and then it's unlike anything else. But there's three different types of cartilages, okay? There's hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fiber cartilage. And we're going to talk about, you know, well, cartilage in general. Always had there's characteristics that make something cartilage, right? And then there's characteristics that separate these three from one another, okay? And then osseous connective tissue, I told you about this. This is what you kind of refer to as bone. You know, there's different forms of bone, but bone is bone, really. It's not made out of different kinds of things, but, you know, you have compact bone and spongy bone, but it's still made out of the same stuff. And we'll look at that a couple of different times. We'll kind of introduce you to bone as a connective tissue here. And then when we, for your second test, study for your second test that it's going to include the skeletal system and what is skeletal system? What's on? It's muscles. Yeah, it's, you have a bone lecture or a PowerPoint. There's a skeletal system PowerPoint, and there's a muscular system PowerPoint. Those three things. But anyway, talking more detail there, but that's bone as an organ, and there's bone as a tissue. Here's we're talking about bone as a tissue, osseous connective tissue, and then finally, the fourth type of connective tissue, this group, vascular connective tissue. That's blood. Why don't you just call it blood? As well, I guess you could. A blood person, some hematologist, I guess that's what you call them. Hematology, yeah, study of blood. They would call it blood, but in the terms of connective tissue, we call it vascular connective tissue, where vascular just means like flowing, it's because it's as a liquid matrix and it can flow, It's not like these other ones that you could cut, You can cut cartilage, you can cut bone, you can cut those connective tissue propers and so forth, but we'll talk about all that. So here we go. You recognize this table. It's just like your epithelial tissue table, but now we're looking at connective tissue. Same kind of thing, where you have a photomicrograph and an illustration, then a little inset, and then your text that follows that. Microscopic appearance, representative location, and its function. Okay, and so we can study this. Okay, so the first tissue that we're beginning with our connective tissue proper, and these first three are part of the loose connective tissues. They see loose connective tissue. I have this drop-down screen that always covers up my notes. Right there. Go away. Still got people entering the class. Anyway, how many people are here? 37 plus 5. 42? 40. Is that right? Yeah. My math is good. Okay, so what do we talk? Okay. Areolar connective tissue. This is our first loose connective tissue, proper. All right. What's areolar? And we've kind of started talking about tissues already in lab. If you're in my labs, you kind of know about this already. And I say it's a loose connective tissue. Remember, loose, you got sparsely distributed cells and proteins and so on and so forth. So that's what you have. You look at this picture right here and you go, what the hell is that? It's just like a mess. Well, under the microscope, wherever you find this stuff, it's kind of just looks like a mess. It doesn't really look some kind of formed tissue. It never looks the same twice. This material, it's a loose arrangement of cells, protein fibers, and other inclusions. And it just kind of, I always like to say that the areolar connective tissue is kind of like a space filler, okay? Because when you cut through an organ and you're looking at tissues, you're never just going to have air in there, just emptiness, just besides cavities and that sort of thing. But filling every nook and cranny and crowding around structures, you're going to have some connective tissue. And most of the time, it's going to be areolar. And that's kind of what it does. It just kind of acts as a space filler. And then with the fibers, it kind of acts as a go-between or like a liaison between structures, anchoring them together and so forth. And so where do you find this? Well, any place that you need something like that. Classic areas to find areolar connective tissue under an epithelial tissue. Now, the epithelial tissue, remember epithelial tissue always rests on a basement membrane, right? And then The basement membrane, in turn, is going to be attached to some underlying connective tissue. It could be connected to some dense connective tissue or some kind of one of those special forms or whatever. But usually, there's a thin layer of areolar connective tissue that helps adhere the epithelial tissue to the underlying substrate or whatever it is. And that kind of connective tissue that's associated with the basement membrane is often referred to as the lamina propria. I wonder if they have that written down here somewhere. You'll see it maybe somewhere else. I don't see it. In lecture, in lab, we talk about it a couple of times. But lamina, that's Latin. And I don't know why they call it the lamina propria. It means, lamina means like layer. Propria means like, I think one's own or something. It's like the layer that belongs to one, something like, I don't know. I'm not sure why they say that. Maybe because it's referring to the layer of connective tissue associated with or owned by, I'm just speculating here, owned by the epithelial tissue. I don't know. So, but it's called the lamina propria. And then the lamina propria has different names and different structures. For example, in the skin, we haven't talked about this yet, unless you're in my lab. In the skin, you have epidermis and dermis, and then the dermis, it's itself is stratified into two layers. There's a papillary layer and a reticular layer. And the papillary layer, that's right underneath the epithelial layer, and it's lamina propria. But we refer to it as the papillary layer of the dermis. Or you have a mucous membrane, it's an epithelial tissue, right? So the tissue underneath a mucous membrane would be the submucosa. So the submucosa is a lamina propria. The dermis, specifically the papillary layer of the dermis, is a lamina propria, and so forth. So there you go. And then in lab, a lot of times I tell students, if they're, we don't really do it this semester so much, when they're actually working with microscope slides, we don't even go to lab anymore. At least my class doesn't. Actually touching microscopes and sharing material and huddled around each other. We gotta like socially distance and stuff, can't do that. So it's all online. But back in the day, we'd huddle around and exchange viral particles with each other and not even think about it. So I can't do that anymore, damn. So anyway, back in the old days when students had to like work in the lab, you got a microscope slide and you're trying to figure out, just kind of searching around. That was part of the challenge in my laboratory, was just trying to figure out how to work the damn microscope. I can't see shit. I don't see. This lab's so hard. I took all that crap out of the equation this semester, and actually last semester. But anyway, I'm telling students, if you're looking at a slide, and everything on there is going to be some kind of tissue of one sort. It's looking at an organ, it looks like structures made out of tissues. And most tissues have a very consistent look to them. They look like that tissue, textbook. Except areolar, it doesn't. It looks just like snot, or you just like this goo on the slide, tucked away in a corner. And so I tell students, if they come across a tissue or some stuff on the slide that doesn't look like anything, it's something, you just don't know what it is, guess areolar connective tissue. If it doesn't look like fat, doesn't look like a tendon, doesn't look like epithelial tissue, just doesn't look like muscle, it's probably areolar connective tissue. So guess areolar. So it's a good guess. No. So there you go. That's our first tissue. What's our second tissue? Remember, all three of these are loose connective tissue because they have loosely distributed fibers and cells and so on and so forth. Now, this one it's called reticular connective tissue. I'm not sure why, because it's not really a connective tissue as it is just a collection of protein fibers. But your book puts it as a connective tissue, and you really can't see this type of tissue. What it is really is just your reticular fibers, or remember the reticulum, like the internal soft skeleton of an organ. So right here, this is like a lymph node, and then right here, remember I said, oh, you can clear and stain a structure, and so all the lymphocytes and all the other functional tissues have been removed, and the only thing that's left behind is the collagen fibers, and that's what you see right here. So really, you cannot see this kind of material unless it's specially prepared to see it. Like on a slide, never guess reticular connective tissue. If you're trying to figure out, oh, that must be reticular. No, it's not. Because you have to look at a slide that's prepared to view reticular connective tissue. And then when you see reticular connective tissue on a slide that's prepared, you can't see anything else. So this is kind of weird. I don't know why. But it's, they listed here. And in my lab, we don't look at it, so don't even worry about that. In some labs, the professors have slides that show this stuff, but I don't. It occurs anywhere. Remember I said it's the internal soft skeleton of an organ. Now they list lymph nodes, spleen, thymus, bone marrow, whatever. The list goes on. It's not just confined to those things, but it's any soft organ that has a reticulum, and it's going to be made out of these real thin, delicate little collagen fibers. Okay. And that's what it looks like. So it's not a real good tissue. It's kind of, we don't even look at it in my lab. Now this third one, this is a fortified tissue, and it's probably histology students, one of their favorite because it's so easy to recognize. Adipose connective tissue. Adipose connective tissue, which you commonly refer to as fat, and it's made up of a bunch of fat cells, which are called adipocytes, right? And that's basically all you see, or is it a collection? Now this is kind of different because we define loose connective tissue as loosely distributed, a lot of extracellular space, but you don't have a lot of extracellular space in adipose connective tissue. Although it is loose, you can separate them pretty easily. It's just kind of a weird thing, but each one of these is a cell. But they look like, often when I'm telling students to look at this in lab, say it looks like you're looking through chicken wire or something, or it's like dried soap bubbles on a piece of glass, or some people say it looks like a bunch of little signet rings next to each other. But each little ring is a cell, a fat cell, adipocyte. And in a living adipocyte, that hollow space you see right there, that's where a lipid droplet was stored. And you see right here, it says lipid in adipocyte. That's like all that yellow stuff. But when you make a slide, you cut through it, all that spills out. So these are just vacant adipocytes. There's no lipid in it. And lipid would be, oily. If you handle fat, your hands feel greasy or oily. That's that lipid. And so where do you find this kind of connective tissue? Well, fat is functional, and it says functions. Well, it says like energy storage. Everybody knows, you pack on the fat, you store fat in the winter, to survive, whatever, packing on fat for winter. Because the lipid can be burned as fuel by your body. It's can be processed and metabolized as energy. But the characteristics of this tissue are unique. If you got collections of adipocytes, it protects against heat transfer or heat loss. I mean, it minimizes the transfer of heat. And that's what insulation does, right? If you want to contain heat, you insulate it. The fat helps prevent heat from leaving. And so in mammals, humans are mammals, and this is true for all mammals, they have subcutaneous fat, which is like a layer of fat underneath their skin, and it's laid down there. Not really. It can be used for fuel, but ideally it's not there for fuel. It's there to help insulate your body so you can maintain a constant, unchanging internal body temperature. That's why all mammals are said to be homeothermic. And the word homeothermic means, homeo means the same, thermic means temperature. So they have a constant, unchanging body temperature. So your body temperature is 37 degrees centigrade or 98.6. Different animals, different things. Dogs are higher, cats are even higher than that. Or lower or higher. I can't remember, but it's different. But they stay the same. You have a body temperature that's the way it is. Not all animals like that. Like frogs and fish and turtles, non-mammals basically. They're not homeothermic. They're called poikilotherms. The poikilo means varying. Something is poikilos. It goes up and down, up and down. Because their body temperature goes up and down, up and down. Your body temperature doesn't go up and down, up and down. It stays the same, unless you're sick. But a frog or a snake or whatever, their body temperature is influenced by the ambient temperature, the outside world. At night, their body temperature is whatever the air temperature is at night. And like during the day, everybody's seen turtles, sitting basking in the sun. They're increasing their body temperature. Why you want to increase your body? It just feels good. They just like the sun. They're catching a tan. No, they're not doing that. They need that influences their physiology. If they could, they need a warm temperature to help digest food and for their muscles to work efficiently and so on and so forth. We don't have to do that because we're warm-blooded. We can digest food just like that. We can take off running. Wake up in the middle of the night, just start taking off. You might not feel like that, but that's a mammal thing anyway. So it's all kinds of great things associated with fat. How'd you do that? So energy reserves. I'm about to sneeze. Hang on. Do I look at light or look away from light when you want to sneeze? You look at light to what? Excuse me. There it went. I think I got it out of it. Okay. What else? Also, if you think of fat, it's soft, right? Like your momo is cushy. Oh, she's so soft. She's so cushy. And because you're feeling fat, momo, and your body capitalizes on that because adipose connective tissue is laid down in areas that need some cushiness. I like to think of adipose as like packing peanuts. If you're going to ship something in a box that's real fragile, put packing peanuts around it to protect it and to insulate it against trauma of being shipped. And so in certain areas of your body, you have these packing peanuts in the form of an adipose capsule that help cushion, to minimize trauma. So it insulates against mechanical trauma. That's mechanical insulation. I think I'm going to sneeze again. Hang on. Maybe not. Maybe I just need a drink. So energy reserves, thermal insulation, mechanical insulation, those are all good. Like around your kidneys, you have an adipose capsule. You have adipose capsules in a lot of places. But you think about your kidneys and your lower back, there's no bone back there. Pretty precarious location. So to help insulate them against mechanical trauma, impact and fat, your eyeballs, behind your eyeballs, between your eye and your skull, there's an adipose fatty pad back there to keep your eyes from popping. If you didn't have that, you press on your eye, you can, crush your eyeball, pop your eyeball. That's kind of gross, isn't it? And then other places here and there, you'll find fat. It's not there for energy reserves. It's not there to keep your kidneys, your eyes warm or anything like that. It's for protection. And then it says shaping the body. That's the last thing they get. And then this insect. Your author is, I need to talk with this guy. What is he thinking? I guess it shows you this. You know what that is? Y'all recognize what that is? What is that? A boob, I heard. It's a boob. Yeah, it's a breast. This is a female thing. And we talked about, I don't know if this class or some point, we talked about secondary sexual characteristics. Anytime you have secondary sexual characteristics or sexually dimorphic, which means sexually dimorphic species, means that the species, the genders look different. There's a lot of gray area nowadays in the 21st century, probably even the 20th century too. A lot of overlap gray in humans. You can't even tell, is that a boy or a girl? I don't know, whatever. But back in the old days, thinking about caveman days or something like that, when you're just kind of just just a human, I'm a species. Her got boobs, her female, that's how it was, But why does she have breast? Guys don't have breast, girls have breast. Well, anytime you got sexually dimorphic species, humans are considered sexually dimorphic. And characteristics you have in one sex that you don't have in the other sex, that's a sexually dimorphic characteristic. For example, facial hair. See this? You don't normally see girls with this. This is a guy thing, and then girls, have breast and whatever. Or what it really is, let me tell you this: the absence of this, the absence of body hair, is a derived female sexual characteristic. The presence of breast is a derived female thing. And so how do these things, anytime you have sexually dimorphic species, not all species are sexually dimorphic. So there are, certain species of birds, the males and females look just alike, but then there's others that males and females look very much different, like a male peacock versus a hen peacock, or it's a peahen and a peacock. What do you call them? Just right, peafowl? Is that what you call them? But the boys look different than the girls. And deer, same thing. You tell a buck from a doe, et cetera, et cetera. But those whatever those characteristics are, like fancy feathers or antlers, those characteristics are bred into existence. And so they're due to sexual selection, and that's what sexual selection, you can Google this and read all about sexual selection. It's one of the forms of natural selection that Charles Darwin talked about, and really interesting stuff. So breast, of course, has no function, like physiological function for your body. I mean, you can live without breast. It's just there for show, to make you look like a female. I can live without a beard, shave it off. Hey, I ain't got a beard, whatever. But there's a lot of things. Bucks, they have the rack. That doesn't change their physiology one way or the other, having the antlers or not having antlers. So why do they have it? Well, you know why they have it? Because does like it. And the bigger the rack, the more does he gets. Get it? So it's all about breeding, and it's called sexual selection. The individuals possess a characteristic, and those individuals mate more often, produce more offspring, and guess what? The genes that allowed that characteristics to exist get passed on. And so that's how these characteristics exist in different populations. So there you go. That's how they came about. So they're just there for shape. you know, I remember when I was a kid, I was trying to figure out why do girls wear a bra? And I used to tease my sisters and say, bras are stupid. You don't need to wear a bra. And so I couldn't figure it out. Why you wear a bra? You know, I thought it was silly. So I don't wear anything like that. And my sister goes, well, why do you wear underwear? I said, I don't know. I'll keep warm, maybe. She goes, well, she didn't know. She said, yeah, same thing, you know. So, oh, well, okay. I guess your boobs get cold. You got to put a bra on them. Anyway. So, loose connective tissue. Now, here's the dense connective tissue. These are two forms of the dense fibrous, dense regular connective tissue, and then look at this, dense irregular connective tissue. Now, if you look at them, they're both same ingredients. The only thing that's different is that one is regular and one is irregular. What does it mean, regular, irregular? Well, let's look at dense regular connective tissue first. What it is just a collection of collagen fibers. Remember those toe straps? But they're all oriented the same direction. They're all on the same plane. And the cells that are in the matrix would be the fibroblasts, and you know the cells that are making and sustaining the collagen fibers. And so you have the collection of all these collagen fibers running in the same direction. And so what this does, remember they're tough, they're heavy duty. Like imagine these a bunch of individual toe straps. That's a lot of strength in one direction, but that's it, just one direction. And so when you need tensile strength just in one plane, just being pulled in one direction, that's where you would invest your dense regular connective tissue. And the only place that you're going to find this stuff is forming tendons and ligaments. Because if you think about how a tendon works, tendons, well, they're pulled on by muscles. And in turn, that tendon is attached to some kind of substrate, usually a bone. You know, it's like anchored to a bone. Could be another muscle, it could be skin, it could be other. Most times it's bone. So the muscle pulls on the tendon pulls on the bone. And that's it. You know, the muscle never pushes, it always pulls in one direction. And it's the same way. And so the fibers are just going in one direction. That's it. And so you got a lot of strength, just going in one direction, that's it. So all the fibers are parallel to one another. They're regularly arranged. So what else? Well, you can have them irregularly arranged. Why would you want to do that? Well, you have tensile strength in many directions, in all axes, the X, Y, and Z axis, because you got fibers going this way, that way, up, down, all around. So it just looks like a scattered mess of collagen fibers every which way. You're still going to have collagen fibers everywhere. You're still going to have a fibroblast in there. And so where on earth would you need something like this? Well, in areas that need that fortification and protection and to stretch, you know, in all directions. Like classic example is right here. You see, you understand what this is an inset of. This is a like a little illustration of the skin. Specifically, this reddish area represents the dermis of the skin. But when we study the skin, we're going to see that there's different layers of the skin. The deepest layer of the dermis is called the reticular layer, and that's what's jam-packed full of dense, irregular connective tissue. Because your skin, you can push your skin, you can pull your skin, you can move in all kinds of directions, and it allows to do that with this dense, irregular connective tissue. Now you can find it in other areas too. Let's see, representative locations, just like fibrous capsules. Oh yeah, forgot about this. Anytime you have a connective tissue membrane around an organ, to act as a substrate for things to attach to it. It's attaching to those collagen fibers, okay? And so very often those membranes are dense irregular connective tissue. For example, surrounding the outside of bone, you have what's called periosteum. Peri, around, osteum, bone. So surrounding the bone, you have this fibrous connective tissue capsule of dense irregular connective tissue. The same thing that occurs around cartilage is called perichondrium. Perichondrium is also made out of dense irregular connective tissue. And then you could have capsules around other organs. Like we'll see when we get to these organs, we'll talk about them. But it's just fibrous capsules, or like the submucosal regions or parts of the lamina propria and that sort of thing. So there you go. There's that. And then this, I made this little slide because this is like one of those tissues that wasn't included in your table. Maybe it is now, but it wasn't back when. And different books treat this tissue differently. But from what I remember, your book says that elastic connective tissue is a form of dense fibrous connective tissue, just like dense regular, dense irregular. But here, what you have, instead of collagen fibers, you have elastic fibers. Some books go on to even identify regular and irregular varieties of this, but we're not going to do that because we're just not going to do it. We're just going to call it elastic connective tissue. And basically, elastic connective tissue is to me, it's barely a connective tissue. It's just elastic fibers by themselves, kind of like reticular connective tissue. Remember, the reticular connective tissue is a loose connective tissue, but it's just reticular fibers. It's just collagen fibers, but loosely arranged. Well, this is kind of in the same category. It's barely a connective tissue because it's just elastic fibers by themselves. They are accompanied with fibroblasts, and these fibroblasts are making the elastic fibers, and they're laying them down just like your little slinkies in organs that need stretch and recoil. And so here I have found in the stroma of the lungs and the walls of large arteries, among other places. Because your lungs expand and then they recoil. Your arteries are under much more pressure than your veins, and they can expand and they need to recoil. And so in the walls, you got the slinkies. And you can see this. Actually, this is highly magnified right here. This is the wall of the aorta, the largest of the arteries, coming right out of the heart. That's a lot of pressure. And see, they're kind of squiggly, kind of look like little slinkies. See that? So those are your elastic fibers. And very often under the microscope, if you're looking at a cross section through a blood vessel, and you see a very dark, squiggly, kind of spring-looking thing going around the lumen, kind of like in the lamina propria area, just in the submucosa, it's going to be an artery. And that allows for that expansion, okay? Now, there's a word here found in the stroma of the lungs and blah, blah. And so I have stroma versus parenchyma. So this is some other buzzwords for you. And I use these words in passing, and I probably define them more than once in this course. But I want you to understand what these two words mean. The stroma of an organ is, your organs have two types of tissue. You have functional tissue and non-functional tissue. So what does that mean? Well, functional tissue would be the tissue and the cells that are allowing that organ to do what it's supposed to do. For example, your lungs are the respiratory system, and their function is respiration. what's respiration? You know, gas exchange, right? And so everything else that's in the lung that's not associated with gas exchange would be like non-functional in that sense, as far as respiration. And so we have names for this. The functional tissue of an organ is known as the parenchyma. The non-functional is the stroma. Okay, stroma. Anytime you hear stroma, if you don't like saying non-functional, it's like, oh, it sounds too insignificant. Well, the stroma is the supporting tissue. It's there for support. It's not like it doesn't have a function. It does have a function, but it's not, doing the primary function. It's like a secondary or supporting or accessory, kind of like that. Like a blood vessel. You say, what's the function of a blood vessel? It carries blood, whatever. So a stroma, supporting tissue, that would fall in that category. And we'll use these terms again: stroma versus parenchyma. Parenchyma is functional. Stroma supportive or non-functional. Okay, there's that. I think I got 5 minutes. I think I can do this. Or should I? You want to quit? I can do this Tuesday. Now, I know you guys are thinking about your first test, because don't I have your first exam slated for next week? Is that when it is? Okay, well, let me tell you something. That's just on paper. You're not going to have your first test before I finish the material. I got to finish this stuff and then the skin, okay? So I don't think we're going to be able to fit and I never do. My first test never falls on the fourth week. So more than likely, your test, I know it on your course policy sheet, it's during the fourth week of class, but it's probably, I was gonna say the fifth week of class, but the fifth week of class, you're gonna have your practicals, right? And then when you have your practicals, and the students are gonna be belly aching about that. Oh, we don't give our lecture test the same week that we're gonna take our practical, right? You don't wanna do that. So just to be a nice guy, because I am a nice guy, although I've been called lots of things. It doesn't bother me if we have it the week after practicals, but but I'm going to finish the material way before then. So I don't like lecturing on stuff. It doesn't matter. But the bottom line is we are going to have our first test after I finish talking about the integumentary system, okay? Whenever that's going to be. I don't know how long after. It might be next week, or it might be the week after that, if you don't want to take it during your practicals time. So, well, I'll let you know. Again, listen to me. If you want to know when your tests are, and when I know for sure, I will change the date on my courses, because your exams are on there, but it has like last semester's dates on it. So just know that. But if it has a date in this year, right, 2021, then it's etched in stone. So, but there's no set date yet. So I know they've been getting emails. Are we having our test next week? I don't know. Probably not. So maybe the week after next or the week after that. So I'll let you know. So pay attention. Listen to the lectures. Eventually you'll find out when the test is, or just look on my courses and look for the most updated test date is. Okay. Any questions about anything? Any other questions about anything? You guys out there in Zoom land have any questions? No? Okay, we'll have this is Thursday, so I'm going to see you guys Tuesday. So have a fun and safe and prosperous weekend, and be good at it, whatever. I'll see you next time. I got to get out of here. How do I get out of here? Right there. Okay, I got a lab this afternoon.